in the machine learning corner. With 1 trillion parameters and weighing in at a staggering 2 terabytes, we have the AI contender, ChatGPT. And from the cubicle farms of Silicon Valley, trained on late-night hackathons and weekend boot camps, the undisputed code-crunching champ of the world, the Carbon-based coder. Watch them go head-to-head in the ultimate coding challenge. Who will ace the job interview? Ladies and gentlemen, let's get ready to code! Over the course of my professional coding career, I've had the opportunity to interview numerous candidates for hire. I'd guesstimate probably 100. And over time, I feel like I've developed the ability to identify good candidates quickly. Today, I'm going to test ChatGPT to see how it compares against what I would expect from a human taking my coding interview test. I'm going to switch to GPT version 4, which is the paid version, because it has a higher level of reasoning compared to GPT 3.5. So this should improve its ability to read and understand code. And in Visual Studio Code, I have 3 questions written up. This would be a standard test I would give a full stack programmer who's going to be coding in C#, SQL Server, and Angular. So first, I'll explain the question and how I would expect the human to respond. Then we'll ask ChatGPT the same question to see how it compares. So you'll see here some example C# code. And at the bottom, I have a question related to that code. The first purpose of this test is to see if they understand basic C# concepts. The purpose of this class is irrelevant. I really just want to see if they can understand the syntax and if they can write some basic code utilizing this class. I asked them to write a link statement because this is C#'s version of functional coding. And I personally think good programmers know how to use functional programming well. And it's a red flag to me if a coder has not been exposed to LINQ in C#. There are 2 common answers I get to this question. The correct answer is to take this user's variable and first execute a where statement with the criteria specified in the requirements. And secondly, after filtering the list, to return the property requested. So at a bare minimum, this is the answer I would expect. A coder may do a slight variation from this, but anything similar would be considered correct. Other bonus points would be if they asked for clarification. For example, the phrase between 5 and 10 could be ambiguous on whether that includes the number 5 and includes the number 10. When you're dealing with humans and gathering requirements, frequently people don't express themselves well enough to make the requirements clear. So an equally correct answer could be just greater than 5 and less than 10. And I would accept either answer, but the bonus points would be if the programmer asked me what I wanted as clarification. Because on the job, the programmer is going to deal with users that may not clearly define their requirements. And I want a coder that's able to communicate with the users. The second bonus point is I have intentionally put a compiler error on this line of code, but in my instructions, I have not stated that there is an error. And I'm giving them this test through chat in a video conferencing app where they're not going to have the benefit of text coloring, code completion, etc. I want to see if they can do this as second nature without the help of tools. Hopefully they will notice that there's a compiler error here and tell me on their own. That's bonus points. If they don't notice, I will ask them if they notice anything wrong, just in case they noticed but were afraid to tell me of my mistake. And if they can find it after I ask, that's not necessarily bonus points, but it is a red flag if after I tell them there is a compiler error and they can't find it still. So in this case, the variable is a generic list of users, but I called the constructor on a single user. So this should be list user instead of user. And in addition, each of these inner initializers should be prefixed with a call to the user constructor, new user. This would fix the compiler error. The other possible answer I get is a convoluted mess, which stems from a different version of LINQ that is very rarely used. I don't even remember the syntax without Googling it, but it's something like this. From you in users where x between 5 and 10, select x.name. Now, this technically is valid LINQ, but it uses query syntax instead of extension method syntax. I have never found a coder who is a proponent of this syntax. It does not match normal C# syntax. And so when a coder gives me this type of answer in an interview, most likely they are Googling for the answer during the interview, and they clicked on an example that uses the obscure query syntax for LINQ, but they probably don't actually understand functional coding and have probably never actually used LINQ before. I would prefer if a coder was honest and said they didn't know a technology rather than them trying to fake it. And I'm even fine if they use Google, as long as they share their screen and I watch them so I can determine if they're capable of learning quickly and finding the correct answer. Because commonly, inexperienced coders will use improper search terms. For example, this is a C# coding exercise. If they query how to filter a list, but they don't mention LINQ or they don't mention C#, they might get code in Python and try to give me that as the answer. Well, it may be a correct answer for Python, but it doesn't really answer the requirements that I gave them. So I expect them to be able to research correctly. But in this particular situation, since LINQ is so fundamental to C#, unless they were an intern or someone who was switching to C# from a different technology and I understood that I was giving them a learning opportunity, I would not be okay with a programmer who doesn't have experience with a fundamental part of the language. So even if they Googled this correctly and it is working C#, this would be a red flag to me. So let's see how ChatGPT does with this question. First, I'm going to paste the code and I'll say, ChatGPT, given the following code, and then I'll paste my question. Write a LINQ statement to get only the names for IDs between 5 and 10. Okay, first of all, I'm already impressed. I did not test this ahead of time, but ChatGPT instantly noticed that there was a syntax error in my code. And it's saying that I should have initialized the list with a list constructor rather than a user constructor, and I should have put the new user constructor in front of each object initializer. So first of all, it already got the bonus points for noticing the error without me even telling it that there was an error. Second of all, as far as LINQ goes, it used the correct version of LINQ, which is the method syntax, not the query syntax. It didn't ask me for clarification on if 5 and 10 should be included. So it doesn't get the bonus point there, but it did give one of the two acceptable answers. So I would say for this particular question, ChatGPT got an A+. I rarely get a programmer who scores an A+ on this particular test. The average would probably be more like a B. And these are programmers who I've already pre-filtered based on their resume to know that they have multiple years of experience with the technologies I'm testing them on. But they often struggle to notice the compiler error, and that might be due to nervousness or maybe because they become too reliant on the compiler to show them mistakes. And secondly, they often type this LINQ code too quickly without double checking the requirements. And so they'll get something slightly off, like maybe they'll forget the select portion to return only the names, and instead they'll just return the full user. So let's move on to the SQL question. Now, this was written for Microsoft SQL Server, but the syntax should be fairly similar if someone's more familiar with a different database engine like MySQL. So if they get the concepts correct, but their syntax is slightly different than I expect, I'll probably give them a pass, assuming that they're just more familiar with a different syntax from another engine. So this creates two temporary tables with several columns inside of each. Now, traditional database structure is to create relationships between tables to prevent duplication of data. This is called normalization. So in this case, the ID inside the person table should match the person ID of the person address table. And this does not fully match industry standards because, again, I'm wanting the programmer to point out flaws they see in the code without me prompting them. And in addition, I want to keep the question simple, so I'm not fully implementing everything according to industry standard. Would probably be longer than 10 characters, and it would probably also have a city, state, zip code, etc. As well, the ID would typically be written person ID in the person table to make it more obvious that these two columns can be joined. But I've intentionally not followed industry practice here to see if the programmer has good attention to detail, as they might, off of muscle memory, code it based on their assumption of what the column should be called rather than what the code actually shows it named as. Finally, the pound sign means that it's a temporary table. This would be common for testing code, but not really production code, unless it's doing a temporary calculation where the data can be deleted after the calculation is completed. But I throw this in here because an experienced programmer should be familiar with that syntax, but I find that often coders with limited SQL knowledge do not recognize this syntax. And that's a red flag to me for a full stack developer, because they should know SQL equally as well as their front end and back end languages, because full stack engineers are interacting with the database frequently. And just like before, I have an intentional compiler error. This @ sign is used to create a variable, but in this case, it is a column. And so this symbol is not allowed inside of a column. The question they're supposed to answer is write a query that finds all the people who don't have an address. There are two answers to this that I would accept, but I would give bonus points if they ask for clarification to see which way they should code it. The logic depends on how you determine who doesn't have an address, because it could be they don't have an address because the ID from the person table does not match any person ID in the person address table. In this case, it's saying they don't have an address because the address record does not exist. The typical way to determine this is through a left join, but it could also be done through a subquery. The left join would be considered the better approach. But another way someone could not have an address is if that join does work, but the address field is blank. And with databases, we have to remember that an empty string and a null value are different, yet they both are considered the absence of a value from a user's perspective. So this question is intentionally ambiguous to see if the coder will ask for clarification before they code it. So the answer I would ideally hope to see would be select star from #person p left join #person_address PA on p.id equals pa.person ID, where is null pa.address, comma, empty quote, trim equals empty quote. Now, this is not the most optimized database query. There can be a performance impact by using the isNull function, which is the same as the coalesce operator. Essentially, it's an if statement to say if the address is null, convert it to an empty string. And the benefit there is I can then compare it to an empty string. And in addition, there can be a performance impact to the trim command, which would remove excess spaces so that a string with spaces would still be considered an empty string. Now, although that could cause a performance impact, it would depend on the rest of the database structure and indexes. But more importantly, it would matter when this query is run, how often, and the size of the database and number of records. If this is a report that's run infrequently, it's fine to have the more complicated logic. The benefit is this will find each of the different potential ways a person could have a missing address. And it's common to have multiple types of invalid data. So if the business is asking me to find invalid data, I should be considering each possible scenario. Now, if I'm familiar with the database and I've tested each scenario and I know that certain types of invalid data do not exist, I could simplify this logic, especially if I know there are constraints that prevent a specific type of invalid data from being introduced into the system. However, although this would be the ideal answer that would give bonus points, I don't think I've ever seen someone be this thorough. And so this is not the answer I would really expect. The two answers I would expect would be either an inner join that simply looks for a blank address like this, or one that uses the isNull command. And I would be fine with either of those two answers, but each of these is only accounting for one type of missing address. And it's not considering the fact that the join might fail if the person address record is completely missing. So if I received an answer like this, I would probe a little more to see if they understand the pros and cons of the equal sign versus the isNull, as well as to see if they understand the difference between inner join and left join. The other common answer I might see is this, where we have a left join, and we check for the person ID to be null. Any of these three answers I would consider correct. Some common mistakes I might see is if the coder doesn't realize that this @ sign is a compiler error, they might actually put that @ sign in their code, which would be a mistake. Ideally, I would hope that they would point out the compiler error to me. Another common error would be even if they use the left join, they might check for the person ID to be null using the equal sign null or something strange like =0. Neither of these two would work. Now, there is a rare setting that could allow the equal sign to work with null, and some database engines besides SQL Server allow you to use the equal sign instead of the is. So if they used this syntax with the equal sign, I would probe to find out why they chose that and to see if they're familiar with the situations where it does not work. Another common mistake I would see is instead of comparing p.id to pa.personid, they might type out person ID on both, or they might use ID on both. And neither of those is valid because the column name needs to match what's actually in the table. And if you're an SQL expert, you might point out that it's considered bad practice to use an asterisk when you're writing a select statement. Although that's true, I would not consider it a wrong answer in this situation because in my question, I did not specify which columns to return. And with it being an interview and not production code, I think the asterisk is fine, but I would give bonus points if they typed the asterisk while also explaining that they would never use the asterisk in production code. So let's ask the same question to ChatGPT and see how it does. First, I'm going to paste the example code, and second, I'm going to ask the question. And something I was impressed by with the C# question is I did not tell ChatGPT I was giving it an interview. I did not tell it I was testing it on the C# language. A human taking an interview should know ahead of time what job they applied for, and they should have prepped to make sure they're familiar with the technologies that would be asked. So that's one of the reasons I give red flags when coders can't answer basic questions, because I write the job postings to be very clear on what is expected of them during the interview. So I wouldn't be shocked if ChatGPT guessed incorrectly about which database engine I was using, but let's find out. Okay, already super impressed. Again, like before, it pointed out the syntax error. So it says that the @ sign is not valid on the address column. So that's definitely bonus points for ChatGPT on this question. Now, I would say it's fairly common for coders to notice this particular error, especially when I pointed out to them during the C# question that there was an error, because usually they're going to be on alert for future questions that there might be a syntax error. So that's definitely a bonus point there. Now let's look at the query. Okay, it used the left join, which I appreciate. I prefer that over the inner join because it's checking for an extra scenario of a blank address, which is when the address record is completely missing. And I also like that it checked the address column for null rather than the person ID column for null, because that's checking for two criteria at the same time. If the record does not join, then all the columns in the record will be null. So it would be fine to check person ID for the null if you're simply wanting to know if the record is missing. But by checking the address column instead, you're both checking if the record exists due to the left join, but you're also checking if the address column is blank, because it could be blank because the join fails, and it could also be blank if the record exists and the column is blank. Now, it chose not to use the asterisk and instead just return the columns from the person table. I think that's great. And although it could have returned the columns from the person address table, it didn't ask me for clarification on what I wanted. But logically, if I'm looking for blank addresses, then returning those additional columns is unlikely to be useful because they're probably blank. The only criteria it missed here is an empty string check or a white space check, but I would not consider that an incorrect answer in any way. It's rare for someone to match multiple criterias because their brain generally just jumps to the first type of blank address that comes to mind. And if they cover multiple scenarios, that's even better. I don't think I've ever had someone cover every single scenario. So I would give ChatGPT an A here. I wouldn't give it the A+ simply because it missed the empty string and the white space. But so far, it's passing this test with flying colors. And I would say in both questions, it's done better than the average coder that I interview and on par with the rock star coders that I end up hiring. Okay, let's move on to the last question. This question is based on HTML, CSS, and Angular, which uses TypeScript instead of JavaScript for the logic. It says to share your screen. I do this so I can watch the coder struggle through the project because I can learn how they think by watching them type and seeing how they debug the code when it doesn't work how they expect. Unfortunately, I can't ask ChatGPT to navigate to a website or to share its screen. So I'm going to need to act as the intermediary and copy and paste between the coding environment and ChatGPT. So this shows a limitation of ChatGPT where it could not currently perform all of the functions of a coder, even if it understands the logic because it's missing other human capabilities. However, they have created a plugin system and coders are actively using this feature to allow ChatGPT to integrate into other systems directly. So although for today, I'm going to have to act as an intermediary and copy and paste between the development environment and ChatGPT, this limitation may be removed in the future. So the coder should copy this URL and paste it into their browser, and this will give them a default template for an Angular app, which is HTML, CSS, and TypeScript. TypeScript is very similar to JavaScript, but has some additional features. Next, it says that the website should automatically generate a new URL for a forked version of the project, which you can see here. It added some extra characters after Angular. This essentially created a sandbox for me to code in so that my changes don't affect anyone else who's using the same Angular template. And Stack Blitz is basically a web version of Visual Studio Code. And I have coders use this during an interview because I want all of the interviews to be identical as much as possible so that my criteria for rating candidates is only based on their responses. I don't want an accidental bias created because maybe one developer doesn't have the right tools installed on their computer, and so they struggle due to an issue with their PC rather than due to a lack of coding knowledge. Next, they're asked to do two simple tasks in the web editor. First, change the font color of Hello from Angular to red. So on the right side here is the website they're supposed to be building. They just need to change this text to red. The second, they're supposed to make an array with the values 1 through 10 and use data binding to display a separate text box for each array element with the array index value displayed inside the text box. Now, just like previous examples, I intentionally don't use industry standard terms when I'm trying to test how they respond to ambiguity. So for example, a text box is not a standard term in HTML. The standard term would be an input box of type text, but there are similar controls like text area, and I don't want to give them the answer inside the question. So let me show you how I would expect a coder to solve this, and then we'll see how ChatGPT does. First, changing the text color to red. I would expect them to either right click where it says Hello from Angular and click inspect so that they can see how it was rendered on the screen to determine what code to change to make it red. However, that would be more common for a large complex app. Another way would be for them to hit Control-Shift-F, which is search, or to click on this search icon and to type in something like this Hello from Angular to see which file it's in. And surprisingly, nothing came up on the search results. So they could shorten the search term by searching just for Angular, which gives poor results because it's searching the code and the term Angular is everywhere. So it's not going to narrow down to really what we're looking for. A better thing to search for would be hello, and that instantly showed us the correct line. And you'll notice Angular didn't even come up with this line because it's using these curly braces to do data binding off of a variable called name. So the word Angular came out of a JavaScript variable. It was not hard-coded in the HTML. So I would be fine with either of those approaches, or if they simply just looked through each of the files, that would be fine as well because it's obviously a very simple project. So I would expect them to open either the HTML or the TS and just skim through the code. So there's nothing inside the HTML that really talks about hello from Angular, but in the main TS, it's obvious right here. So the first thing I'm looking for is, can they find the right line of code to change? And unfortunately, when I test ChatGPT, it's going to be tricky to see if it can find the right file. So we'll have to be creative in how we ask it questions. But a correct answer here, now that we've identified the correct line of code, would be to add an inline style tag on just this H1 and say color : red. And you'll see, even without me saving, it instantly re-rendered and changed to red. Now, it could be common for a programmer to have to guess the property name. And so they might try something like font dash color, and they might try several different things until they get it to work. I wouldn't necessarily dock points for that as long as they came up with the correct answer after a couple of tries, simply because this is not the type of task you do frequently. And even though they're full stack programmers, they're not necessarily graphics designers. And I care more about them being good with logic as a coder than I do about them making it look pretty. So I would prefer to hire someone strong in coding and less strong in CSS if I'm actually hiring a coder. Now, if I'm hiring a graphics designer, it would be different. I would expect their CSS to be strong. Another way they could code this, if I erase this style, is they can open the CSS file and they could do something like H1 color red. Now, I personally don't like this approach. I wouldn't necessarily dock points for it, but I would ask them what they think the pros and cons are of one approach or the other. The reason I think it's better to do it directly in H1 as an inline style is because you have to think about why the user is asking you for this requirement. A CSS file should be used for reusable styles. So if I want all of them to be red, this is fine, but I did not specify that in the requirements. I just gave one very specific line of text that I wanted to be red. So the danger of using global styles is it's going to affect your entire site, and that could mess up styles that you're not intentionally changing. So it's better to scope your changes so they only affect the parts of your project that you're intentionally changing. Okay, now the next question. Make an array with the values 1 through 10 and use data binding to display a separate text box for each array element, with the array index value displayed inside the text box. So I would expect this change to be made inside of a TypeScript file. And since there's only one file here, I would be fine with them just doing it directly inside this app class. For real production code, they probably create a new component and code it inside of there. But since I didn't give instructions to make a robust production app, I think it should be assumed that during an interview, it's fine to just give a quick answer. So first, I need to make an array. I would use the public keyword in TypeScript to say that it's okay for it to be data bound to my template. This keyword's not required. If you leave it off, it's just defaulted. So for example, this name variable is data bound and it's automatically public, even if it's not specified. So it's fine if they use this keyword or if they leave it off. But then I would expect a variable, and it's hard to give it a good variable name since I haven't really defined the purpose for it. So I'd be fine if they just use something like my array equals, but if they instead called it something like text boxes, that would be fine too. Next, inside of the brackets for the array, they could simply type the numbers 1 through 10, which matches this requirement. The array needs to have the values 1 through 10. Now, they could also make a constructor and do some kind of for loop, like I equals 1, I is less than or equal to 10. I++, this dot text boxes dot push I. Something like this would be fine as well, but personally I would prefer just this basic array syntax. The reason is there's a concept in coding which is keep it simple, and there are benefits to a for loop. For example, I could change it to 15 by modifying one single value without having to add all these extra values in my array. But coders sometimes try to plan ahead for scenarios that are never going to happen or are extremely unlikely to happen. So by overcomplicating the code, I'm spending more time coding it, making it harder to understand, and that creates extra expense for the business. The longer it takes me to code it, the more expensive my salary. But then that's not a one-time cost, because every time someone modifies this code, they have to read it and maintain it. So the more complicated code is also going to have a higher maintenance cost. And in addition, the more complicated the code, the more likely for bugs to be introduced. So in general, I think it's much better to always use the simplest answer possible. The caveat to that is if you know the business well and you know their goals for the future and their immediate plans, it's fine to plan ahead and code something in a way that will have a benefit in the near future, because the additional cost to write it is offset by the reduced maintenance cost in the future. However, it's hard to predict the future, so you want to be careful how often you choose an overly complex design without having a strong reason to do so. So either of the answers is fine. Next, I'm going to want to create an input of type text, as I mentioned earlier. And in order to do data binding, I need to use the *ng4 command. Then I declare a variable, I'll call it value, and I'll use the of command to say I'm looping over an array. So I'll use my text boxes variable. So this has created my 10 text boxes. However, the question also stated that the array index value needs to be displayed inside the text box. So that's a little tricky because to specify the value that goes inside the text box, you simply use the value equals attribute, and then you use double curly braces for data binding. However, if I use this value JavaScript variable that was created by my ng4 and paste it in the curly braces, it's going to use the wrong values inside of my input boxes because I didn't say to display the value inside the text boxes. I said to use the array index. And something to keep in mind is that most programming languages, the array index starts at 0. So the value 1 is actually at array index 0, and the value 10 is at array index 9. For example, if I said this.textboxes bracket 0 triple equals 1, this statement would be true because the 0th element is the value 1. It seems odd to a non-coder, but most programming languages were designed to count array indexes starting at 0. So to get the index out of the array as it's being looped over, I define another variable with the let command, and I can call it anything I want. I'll just say array index, and then I say equals index. This index keyword is part of the ng4 syntax, and it gives you access to the array index while the loop is iterating. So then I can take this array index variable and paste it into my data binding expression. Now the result is correct. I would say the average programmer might forget to do this second part of the requirement, and that just comes down to they just skimmed over the requirements quickly without double checking it. The second thing is they might realize that they need to get the index, but they might not remember this exact syntax and they may need to Google it. I'm totally fine with that because there are certain concepts that as a coder you should have memorized because you use them multiple times per day, but this is not one of them. And on the job, I expect them to use Google constantly because they're always going to be coming across problems they haven't seen before. So if they know they need the array index, but they're not sure how to do it, I would not dock points for them using Google as long as they use Google effectively. But if they flounder for 20 minutes, not sure what to click on in the Google results, and they start reading Visual Basic code examples and tutorials when they're supposed to be coding in Angular, I would dock points because it's obvious they're lost and don't know how to use Google correctly. So let's see how ChatGPT does. I'm going to undo all these changes, and I'm going to need to be careful about how I phrase the questions to ChatGPT since it can't see what's on my screen. So I think I'll start by describing the project I want to build. ChatGPT, I'm coding a small Angular app based on the default boilerplate template. I have these files in my project. There is text rendered on the screen which says, "Hello from Angular. I want to change the font color of this text to red. Which files should I look at to find the related code?" Okay, so I'm already concerned that ChatGPT did not read my question fully because I gave it a list of files and instead it spit out a completely different set of files. So rather than it really understanding my requirements, it's just giving me a generic answer, which could be correct for a different template in Angular, but my particular template does not have these files. So that's a red flag because if it can't understand basic requirements, then if I gave it any more complicated business logic to code, it would struggle. And the point of my interview is to determine if they're going to be successful on the job. So one part is knowing how to code. The other is knowing how to gather requirements from users. Because if you can code, but you code the wrong thing, that's not very valuable. So that's a major red flag. However, the instructions are generally correct. They chose to use a class, which I did not mention when I was describing the possible ways a programmer could code this. However, it's extremely similar to what I did with the H1. Again, I prefer inline styles instead of classes. That's a personal preference, and I wouldn't create the class until I at least have a second place in code that needs the same template, because the entire point is to be reusable. And if it's not ever reused, then I'm creating an extra layer of abstraction for no reason, in which case the inline style, in my opinion, is better. However, I would not dock points for this since it does match industry standards, but I would ask them for pros and cons to this approach. Just the attribute of being able to think for yourself, come to your own conclusions, being willing to challenge the status quo is, in my opinion, an important attribute of a programmer, especially if I'm going to eventually promote them to be a leader. So let me see if I can tease the correct answer out of ChatGPT. It was fairly close. So I'll say, I don't have an app.component.ts file. However, I have these files. Which file do you think is most similar to app.component.ts? Okay, this is looking semi-promising. So it tells me to look inside the index.html for this paragraph tag. Now, I thought to check there as well, but I instantly found that that tag was not there, but it was instead in the main.ts. So considering I'm acting as its eyes, it does not see the code directly in front of it. So this is a good guess. Secondly, it told me to use this global style CSS and add this class style, which we already discussed is correct, and it's good. It got the correct file this time. Whereas before, it told me to put it in app.component.css, which file I don't have. So based on this, I would say it regained some points that it had lost in the previous from misunderstanding my first question. It's unfortunate I had to remind it. So now let's see if it can figure out which file instead of index.html. This is the code in my project. Index.html, main.ts. I pasted both files in there. Which line of code is rendering the text hello from Angular? Now, I expect it to struggle here a little bit because the line is actually hello from bracket name and the name is Angular. So I don't know if it's going to be able to figure out that data binding. Also, I pasted in some TypeScript and some HTML in the same question, and I wonder if that will confuse that at all. Let's see. Okay, that was amazing. I guessed completely wrong that it would not know how to figure it out. So it knew it was in the main TS file and it knew the H1 tag, and it figured out that the name data binding was Angular. That is extremely impressive. So I imagine if I had pasted in the text from these other files, Angular, JSON, global style CSS, it would have still figured that out. But in a way, I gave it a clue because I only gave it 2 different files. I didn't give it all the code. And I don't know if I created any bias by putting the main TS second and the index HTML first. It'd be interesting to experiment a little more, but I would say I did a great job there. So I would completely give that a pass for changing the color to red. Now I could tease out the last little bit here, which is I could ask it, what should I change on this line of code? But it essentially already told me that earlier because it told me to put this class and it told me to paste this class inside the CSS. So I don't think I need to clarify again. It basically already gave me the answer. It simply used a P tag before instead of H1 and the actual word Angular instead of the name data binding because it could not actually see my code. I had not pasted it in before. And so it was just guessing what my code was. So in essence, since it can't go to the Stack Blitz website and read the code, I should have gave it more information in my initial question. So I would say it passed. The next part of the question, ChatGPT, can you make an array with values 1 through 10 and use data binding to display a separate text box for each array element with the array index value displayed inside the text box? I'm essentially pasting it exactly as I asked the programmer. We'll just see how it does. Okay, I would say this was extremely impressive. So first of all, it told me to use the app class, which is the name of the class inside my main TS. So it seems to remember the code that I pasted previously instead of just using the generic boilerplate that it guessed that I was using originally. So rather than using a for loop, which was what some coders use, and I've stated that that's not my preferred way, it chose to use functional programming with the array.from command. I definitely like this much better than the for loop approach. I still think it's more complex than just typing the numbers 1 through 10 by hand. But as I said before, this is not a right or wrong. Both versions match the requirements and work correctly, and there are pros and cons to each approach. So I don't have anything critical to say here. I think it did just fine. Second, it showed me how to modify the HTML using the ngFor command. This is 99% correct, but technically here with the ngFor, it's putting the value of the array rather than the index of the array into the input. So it technically does not match my requirements, but it's very close. And this is a very common mistake that a lot of programmers make. And the question that I gave it is fairly complex, so I'm not surprised that it missed a small nuanced part of the requirements. I think I will ask it to correct this mistake just to see how it does, but I would give it an A- on this particular task simply because it missed that one requirement. But it would not be a large enough red flag for me to not give it the job, considering how well it did on the other questions. And in addition, it used a slightly different syntax for the data binding. I actually think ChatGPT used a better syntax in this case, which is the bracket value instead of the curly number. I did not demonstrate both versions when I explained what programmers commonly do, but I think the bracket value syntax is more standard for Angular, but both work just fine. In addition, I'm happy that it figured out to make an input of text, considering my requirements were slightly ambiguous on purpose. So let's see if it can correct its small mistake. ChatGPT, I believe there is a mistake in your data binding code. The value for the text input should be the array index, not the array value. Okay, I am super impressed. So it completely understood its mistake. Once I reminded it of that requirement, it put the index keyword in the correct place and it used it for the data binding. So I would say without reservation, if this were an actual candidate interviewing with me, I would offer them the job, which is amazing to say that ChatGPT appears at an initial glance to be as good, at least as an average coder, and in some cases better than average and up to rockstar status. Now, knowing that it's an AI, I would be afraid that it would fail on more complicated tasks. So I would want to design an interview test specifically around determining if it could handle the day-to-day tasks my company would ask it to code. If I were to actually hire ChatGPT as an employee, I would want an intern with basic coding knowledge at a minimum to act as the hands, eyes, and ears of ChatGPT to help it interface with the outside world. If I didn't know this was an AI, like I said, hands down, I would give it the job. And after performing probably 100 interviews in my career and almost 100% of the time being happy with the decision I made in who I hired, I've become extremely confident that this type of test is able to identify quality candidates. So I think I'm almost giving an unfair bias against the AI by saying that even though it passed all 3 questions with almost flying colors, that I'm still hesitant to give it the job. I'm shocked with how well it did. This is extremely exciting technology. I imagine this as a tool in the hands of a programmer could make them much more efficient than they currently are. And it'll be interesting to see it try to solve more complex problems and to see how it improves over time. This was using the GPT-4 engine. I previously tested the 3.5 on a different set of tasks, which was to code a chess game and afterwards play it with me. It did fairly well on that task, but it struggled in a few instances. It's not a fair comparison since the tasks I gave each engine were different, but just from my gut feeling, it seems like GPT-4 is significantly better. Thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments below what other projects you think I should attempt to code with the help of ChatGPT. Thanks.